I used to believe that control was everything, that the ability to dominate my thoughts, my time, my future, and even my emotions was the only way to survive in a world that rewards speed, aggression, and certainty. And for most of my life, that belief worked, or at least it looked like it worked from the outside, because control gave me momentum, and momentum created results, and results silenced doubt. But what people never saw was the cost of that control, the constant tension in my mind, the noise that never shut off, the endless calculations running in the background even when I was supposed to be resting. Because when you build your life on control, you don't relax, you only pause. And even in those pauses, your mind stays armed, scanning for threats, failures, weaknesses, inefficiencies. And I told myself that this was strength, that this was what it meant to be driven, that if I ever slowed down or softened, I would lose everything I had built, because the world doesn't wait and it doesn't care how tired you are. So I learned to live in a permanent state of pressure, pushing forward even when my body said stop and my mind said enough. And over time, that pressure became familiar, almost comforting, like noise you don't notice until it disappears. And then something unexpected happened. Something I never planned for and never optimized for. Someone entered my life who didn't try to fix me, didn't challenge me, didn't compete with me, didn't demand explanations or performance or brilliance. They simply existed with a kind of calm that didn't ask permission, a calm that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. And at first it irritated me because calm felt inefficient, it felt slow, it felt like a threat to the systems I had built inside myself. But the strange thing was that when they were around, the noise in my head lowered, not because I forced it to, but because it had nowhere to stand, and that terrified me more than chaos ever did, because chaos was familiar and calm was not. Chaos I could control, calm I could not. And I realized something uncomfortable in that moment, that my identity was built around resistance, around tension, around always being in opposition to something, a problem, a deadline, a doubt, a fear. And when that resistance disappeared, even briefly, I didn't know who I was without it. And that's when I understood why peace scares ambitious people. Because peace doesn't ask you to prove yourself, it doesn't reward your overthinking, it doesn't care how hard you push, it just exists. And when someone brings that kind of peace into your life, it exposes how much of your strength was actually fear in disguise, fear of slowing down, fear of feeling, fear of being seen without armor. And I started noticing small changes, subtle ones at first, like the way my shoulders dropped when they sat next to me, or how my breathing slowed without effort, or how silence stopped feeling like wasted time and started feeling like space. And those moments confused me because I had spent years believing that discomfort was the price of progress, that exhaustion was proof of commitment, that rest was something you earned only after winning. But here was someone who made rest feel natural, undeserved, unconditional, and that challenged everything I thought I knew about success. Because if calm could exist without sacrifice, what did that say about all the suffering I had normalized? And I didn't want to admit it, but I began to depend on that calm, not in a weak way, but in a deeply human way, because for the first time my mind experienced what it felt like to not be at war with itself. And losing that internal battle felt like losing control, because control had always meant holding everything tightly, gripping the steering wheel even when my hands were bleeding. And now something inside me was loosening its grip without my consent. And that loss of control scared me more than failure ever did, because failure is external and recoverable. But this felt internal and irreversible, like once you know what, peace feels like you can't unlearn it. And I realized that the reason this one person changed everything wasn't because they saved me or healed me or completed me, but because they showed me a version of myself that existed without constant pressure, a version that didn't need to perform to be valuable. And that realization cracked something open inside me, because if that version was real, then maybe control was never he goal. Maybe control was just a shield I built to survive a world that never taught me how to feel safe. And the truth is, when someone calms you, you don't lose control of your life. You lose control of the illusion that you were ever fully in control to begin with. And that's the beginning of something far more dangerous and far more powerful: awareness. Because once you become aware of how much of your drive is fueled by unrest, you have to face a difficult question. Are you building your future out of purpose, or are you running from silence? And that question doesn't have an easy answer, but it's one that changes you the moment it enters your mind. And that's where everything started to shift for me. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a breakdown or a breakthrough, but in the quiet realization that the calm I was afraid of wasn't my enemy. It was showing me what I had been missing all along. Once that calm entered my life, I couldn't unsee what it revealed because awareness doesn't knock politely, it dismantles quietly. And I started noticing how much of my daily behavior was driven not by vision but by avoidance. How often I filled every moment with noise, work, stimulation, decisions, not because they were necessary, but because stillness made me uncomfortable, and that discomfort had nothing to do with boredom and everything to do with vulnerability. Because in silence, you hear the questions you've been outrunning, the doubts you've buried under productivity, the emotions you postponed because they didn't fit into the schedule. And I realized that my obsession with speed wasn't about efficiency, it was about control. Because when you move fast enough, you don't have to feel deeply. And feeling deeply is dangerous when you've trained yourself to survive by staying sharp, detached, and forward facing. But this person didn't rush me, didn't push for answers, didn't try to pull me out of my intensity. They simply stayed present. And presence is disruptive in a world built on distraction because presence forces honesty, and honesty exposes contradictions. And one of the biggest contradictions I had to face was that I preached long-term thinking while living in a constant state of short-term emotional avoidance, building rockets to reach the future while avoiding the present. And that tension began to surface in ways I couldn't ignore because the calmer I felt on them, the more restless I became when they weren't there. And that restlessness scared me because I had never depended on anyone emotionally. I had built my life to be self-contained, self-fueled, self-correcting, and now something external was affecting my internal state. And I didn't like how powerless that made me feel, because power to me had always meant independence, the ability to function without reliance. But this calm was not something I could manufacture or simulate. It wasn't the result of discipline or intellect. It was relational, and that made it uncontrollable. And the irony was that the more I tried to analyze it, the less effective my analysis became, because calm doesn't respond to logic, it responds to trust, and trust is not a calculation, it's a surrender. And surrender felt like a threat to everything I had built, because if I allowed myself to trust this calm, what else would I have to let go of? The constant vigilance, the emotional distance, the belief that loneliness was a necessary trade-off for ambition, and I began to question whether the cost of my success was as unavoidable as I once believed. Because here was proof that connection didn't weaken my focus, it sharpened it, but in a different way, not by pressure, but by clarity. Because when your mind isn't fighting itself, it can actually think. And that terrified me, because it meant that some of my achievements may have come not because of my suffering, but in spite of it. And if that was true, then maybe the narrative I had built around pain being essential was flawed. And that realization created resistance inside me, because we defend the stories that justify our sacrifices, especially when those sacrifices have defined us. And I found myself pulling away at times, creating distance, reasserting control, not because they had done anything wrong, but because closeness was dissolving the armor I depended on. And the thing about armor is that it protects you, but it also isolates you. And I had worn it for so long that I forgot the weight of it, forgot how much energy it took just to keep it on. And moments of calm felt like taking it off. And that exposure was terrifying, because without armor, you're visible. And visibility invites loss. And loss is something you cannot optimize against. And yet, those moments of calm, I felt more myself than I had in years, not the version of me the world applauds, but the version that exists before expectations, before strategies, before performance. And that version didn't want to dominate or conquer or outpace anything. It just wanted to exist without pressure. And that created a fracture inside me, because my ambition didn't disappear, but it softened, and softness felt like weakness even though it made me stronger. And I struggled with that contradiction, because the world celebrates intensity, not equilibrium, and I had built my reputation on intensity, on pushing limits, on refusing to slow down, and now something inside me was asking a dangerous question. What if slowing down doesn't mean stopping? What if it means aligning? And alignment is far more powerful than force, because force burns energy while alignment directs it. And that thought wouldn't leave me, because I could feel the difference in my thinking, in my creativity, in my patience. And yet I resisted fully accepting it, because accepting it would mean admitting that I didn't have to suffer as much as I thought I did. And that's a hard truth to swallow when suffering has become part of your identity. And I realized that the reason this one person changed everything wasn't because they calmed my life, but because they calmed my mind. And once your mind experiences that kind of peace, you can't go back to glorifying chaos without feeling a lie in it. And that's when I understood that losing control wasn't about becoming weak or dependent. It was about releasing a version of strength that was built on fear. And fear, no matter how productive it looks, is still fear. And it eventually asks for a price. And the calm I was afraid of was asking me to pay attention instead. The final shift didn't arrive as a decision or a declaration. It arrived as acceptance, quiet and irreversible, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes the direction of everything that follows, because once you stop fighting calm, once you stop treating peace like an interruption instead of a signal, you begin to see your life with a different level of honesty. And I started to notice how much energy I had wasted maintaining the image of control, how many choices were made not because they were right, but because they kept the machine running, and the machine had become familiar, productive, impressive, but also exhausting. And what this one person did, without ever trying, was show me that my value didn't disappear when I wasn't pushing, that my relevance didn't evaporate in stillness, that my worth wasn't tied to constant output, and that realization didn't make me less ambitious, it made me more precise, because ambition without self-awareness is just noise, and clarity is a far more powerful fuel than chaos. And I began to understand that the reason losing control felt so frightening was because control had been my language for safety, the only one I knew. And when someone brings you calm, they introduce a new language, one that doesn't rely on tension to function, and learning that language feels like losing fluency. At first, you stumble, you hesitate, you misunderstand, but slowly you realize it's not taking anything from you, it's expanding you. And I had to confront a hard truth that much of my drive was built during times when I felt unseen, unheard, unsafe. And that drive served its purpose. It got me here, but it wasn't meant to be permanent, because survival strategies are not life strategies, and holding on to them too long turns strength into limitation. And I saw that clearly for the first time, that the same intensity that built my future was quietly narrowing my present. And calm wasn't asking me to abandon my vision. It was asking me to stop punishing myself while pursuing it. And that distinction matters because discipline doesn't require suffering, focus doesn't require isolation, and progress doesn't demand emotional starvation. Those are myths we tell ourselves to justify imbalance. And when someone calms you, they don't weaken your edge, they sharpen it by removing unnecessary friction. And friction feels productive until you realize how much it slows you down over time. And I began to trust that calm, not blindly, but consciously, allowing it to exist without immediately trying to control it or explain it away. And doing so, I noticed something unexpected. My decisions became cleaner, my reactions less defensive, my thinking less reactive, because when you're no longer at war with your inner world, you stop projecting that war onto everything else. And that changed the way I approached work, relationships, even failure, because failure stopped feeling like a threat to my identity and started feeling like data again. And that's a powerful shift, because fear distorts information while calm clarifies it. And I understood then that the greatest cost of constant control is not burnout, it's blindness, because when you're always braced for impact, you miss nuance, you miss connection, you miss the subtle signals that guide better decisions. And the calm this person brought into my life wasn't about comfort, it was about awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable at first because it removes excuses, it removes the ability to blame pressure for poor balance, and it asks you to take responsibility not just for your success, but for your inner state. That's a level of accountability most people avoid, because it means admitting that some of your suffering is optional, and optional suffering is harder to justify than unavoidable pain. And that's why people run from calm, because calm forces you to confront the gap between who you are and who you've been performing as. And I realized that the reason this one person changed everything wasn't because they stayed forever or because the story ended perfectly, but because they altered my internal baseline. They raised the standard for how my mind could feel. And once that standard exists, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to glorifying exhaustion without feeling the cost. And that's the real transformation. Not romance, not dependency, but recalibration. Because when your nervous system learns that safety is possible, it stops mistaking stress for purpose, and you begin to choose differently, not dramatically, but consistently. And consistency is what reshapes a life. And I don't believe losing control means falling apart anymore. I believe it means releasing the illusion that you must suffer to matter. And that illusion is deeply embedded in high achievers because we confuse pressure with progress. And letting go of that confusion doesn't make you soft, it makes you sustainable. And sustainability is what allows vision to outlast intensity. And that's the lesson that stayed with me. That calm is not the absence of ambition. It's the foundation that allows ambition to endure. And the one person who calmed me didn't take anything away from who I am. They revealed who I am without fear driving the system. And once you experience that, everything changes, not because the world slows down, but because you finally stop running from yourself.